You are about to listen to a snippet of the Terra Incognita podcast. For the full episode, please click on the Patreon link below. Okay, thank you very much. Alright, welcome back to the Terra Incognita podcast. This is episode 6 of my series on the life of Friedrich Nietzsche. In this episode, we're going to talk about Nietzsche's attitude towards the political developments of his time, his attitudes towards nationalism, socialism, and mass democracy. Nietzsche lived during a tumultuous age. We have a tendency now to view the 19th century as a peaceful time, but this couldn't be further from the truth. Many 19th century people felt like they were living in an age of prolonged revolution, an age of constant, radical, and disturbing change. The map of Europe was chopping and changing, workers were being politically mobilized, monarchies were falling, democracies were rising, small kingdoms were being subsumed into large, centralized nation-states, revolutionary ferment was in the air. The world historic transformation from the ancient regime of princely rulers to the new democratic age was well and truly underway. What did Nietzsche think about this world historic transformation? That is the question that I hope to answer in this episode. Before I begin, I'd like to briefly recap what was spoken about in episode 5 of this series. In the last episode, we spoke about Nietzsche's first year at Basel University. At the age of just 24, Nietzsche was invited to take up the chair of philology at Basel University. He was the youngest person to ever assume that chair. He managed to become a professor without even having completed a degree, which was highly unusual. Typically, the University of Basel wouldn't make such a young man a professor, especially, someone who didn't even have a degree, like Nietzsche. But Nietzsche's professor, Ritschl, had given him an outstanding character reference, so they decided to extend the invitation anyway, even though he was young and didn't have his degree yet. So after receiving the invitation, Nietzsche moved to the city of Basel in Switzerland. He began teaching at the extremely small university. Indeed, Basel Uni, I think, had like 120 students. So Nietzsche taught the history of Greek literature, ancient Greek religion, Plato and pre-Platonic philosophy, and Greek and Roman rhetoric. He made his pupils write about the Dionysian cult. One of his colleagues at the university was Jacob Burckhardt, the distinguished Swiss historian. The two men became close acquaintances. They would go on long walks through the city of Basel and discuss art, antiquity, and the German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer. Burckhardt would end up having a profound influence over Nietzsche. Burckhardt believed that small states promoted cultural flourishing, a perspective that he gained from his historical studies of ancient Greece and Renaissance Italy. He believed that the culture of antiquity and the Renaissance could be attributed, in no small part, to the city-state model. It should come as no surprise, then, that he opposed nationalism and large, centralized states. He believed that the large, centralized nation-state would lead to the cultural sterility of Germany. He believed that German nationalism would promote conformity and suppress local diversity. He was, therefore, opposed to German nationalism. At this time, Nietzsche was still a nationalist, but he would eventually adopt Burckhardt's point of view, or at least, come to share part of it, as we'll see in this episode. Beyond politics, Burckhardt's interpretation of antiquity and the Renaissance profoundly impacted Nietzsche. Burckhardt challenged the idealized, rational image of ancient Greece promoted by earlier German classicists such as Winckelmann. He believed that there was a dark, irrational side of Greek life that had been overlooked. He made a similar argument about Renaissance Italy. Nietzsche adopted this idea, believing that cultural creativity was linked with social chaos and violence, an idea that found expression in his first book, The Birth of Tragedy, which we're going to discuss in the next episode. Anyway, Nietzsche spent the weekdays in Basel lecturing or walking around the city with Jacob Burckhardt. He would spend the weekends with Wagner at his house in Tribschen. Tribschen, which was in the center of Switzerland, was about 3 hours away from Basel 3 hours via train. Nietzsche began regularly visiting Richard Wagner at his family home. The two men developed a close relationship. Indeed, Nietzsche was considered part of the family. He had his own room in Wagner's house and was even asked to be the guardian of Wagner's son, should anything happen to him. What explains this closeness? Well, as I said in the previous episode, Nietzsche was one of the few people who actually understood Wagner's vision or mission. Most people weren't capable of understanding Wagner's writing. They admired his music, but failed to grasp the deeper philosophical or cultural project behind his work. Nietzsche was one of the few people who actually understood it, and for that reason, he became one of Wagner's most valuable friends. To quote a letter that Wagner wrote to Nietzsche, "I now have nobody with whom I can take things up with as seriously as I can with you." In other words, Nietzsche became Wagner's most valuable interlocutor. So that's a brief summary of what life was like for Nietzsche in 1869. The 24-year-old spent his time with Burckhardt, Wagner, and lecturing at Basel University. And his life looked very similar at the start of 1870. However, this routine would be interrupted by the Franco-Prussian War, which erupted on the 19th of July, 1870. Napoleon III declared war on Bismarck's Prussia, the French invaded Germany, and all of Germany came together to repel this invasion. And they successfully did so. They pushed the French back into their own country, and eventually found themselves on the outskirts of Paris. Nietzsche was still a committed German nationalist at this time, and he was eager to support his country during the Franco-Prussian War. He requested and received leave from his university to serve as a medical orderly in the Franco-Prussian War. He trained briefly in Bavaria before being thrust into the war, where he treated the wounded on various battlefields. His service culminated in a grueling 3-day train trip back to Germany from France. The train was full of wounded soldiers, and Nietzsche was their sole caretaker. He spent 3 exhausting days and nights looking after them. Nietzsche himself got sick in the process. Upon arriving in Germany, he was put in hospital. Now, I would briefly like to discuss the conclusion of the war. As I said in the last episode, the unity of the German nation was proclaimed on the 18th of January, 1871. 10 days after the proclamation of the German Empire, the war came to a close. The French government came to terms with Prussia, and a peace treaty was signed. But the conflict did not end with this peace treaty. The people of Paris were enraged by their government's capitulation to the Prussians. They felt like they had been betrayed. Indeed, a sort of stab-in-the-back myth began to spread among the Parisians. They felt like members of the French aristocracy had sabotaged the war effort. The city was therefore on the verge of revolt, like after the peace treaty had been signed. Sensing this, the French government sent troops into Paris to disarm the people, disarm them. But radicalized working-class Parisians rose up against the troops and drove them out of the city. The government, army, and wealthy Parisians had to retreat to Versailles. Left-wing militants barricaded Paris and declared a commune. This became known to posterity as the Paris Commune, and it was one of the most radical political experiments in European history. The leaders of the Commune attempted to collectivize property and found a totalitarian state devoted to the interests of the proletariat. The tricolour flag of the French Republic was replaced with the red flag of socialist revolution. The Paris police force was abolished, prisoners were freed, and crucifixes were removed from schools and hospitals. Church-going was forbidden. The Communards, which was the name given to the left-wing militants who supported the Commune, indiscriminately slaughtered Parisians. Clergymen and innocent bystanders were cut down. War was made on culture too. Monuments that were considered relics of an oppressive past were smashed and overthrown. The museums and palaces of Paris were looted and burned in a vengeful frenzy against the aristocracy. There's a quote from the French author and conservative Victor Hugo that was extremely prophetic. He wrote this in 1848, but it reads like a description of the Paris Commune of 1871. So, I'm going to quote Victor Hugo now. "Socialism, or the Red Republic, is all one, for it would tear down the tricolour and set up the red flag. It would knock down the statue of Napoleon. It would suppress the Academy and the Polytechnic and the Legion of Honour. It would bring about a general bankruptcy. It would ruin the rich without enriching the poor. It would destroy labour, which gives to each one his bread. It would abolish property and family. It would march about with heads on pikes, fill the prisons with the suspected, and empty them by massacres. It would convert France into the country of gloom. It would strangle liberty, stifle the arts, silence thought, and deny God." End quote. Like I said, that was written in 1848, but it almost perfectly describes the Paris Commune of 1871. For 72 days, Paris was gripped by chaos and terror. On the 28th of May, the French army left Versailles and conquered Paris. They executed tens of thousands of workers and revolutionaries in what is now known as the Bloody Week. The French army killed 30,000 commutards. Yes, I believe that's the French pronunciation. It's pronounced commutard. Here is how one of the commutards described Paris during the Bloody Week. "A workshop, an immense workshop, but a workshop in which machine guns are at work. A workshop in which the work of destruction is accomplished on such a great scale. It's a horrible cacophony, this infernal noise of hatred and passion." Marx described this event as a war of the enslaved against their enslavers. To quote him, "Working men's Paris, with its commune, will be forever celebrated as the glorious harbinger of a new society. Its martyrs are enshrined in the great heart of the working class. Its exterminators history has already killed. All prayers of their priest will not avail to redeem them." Anyway, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that the Paris Commune was one of the defining events of the 19th century. Revolution was quite a common thing in 19th century Europe. As I have said on previous episodes, the most widespread wave of revolution in European history occurred in 1848, just 4 years after Nietzsche's birth. But there was something different about the Parisian Revolt of 1871. The Paris Commune was a socialist revolution, rather than a liberal or national revolution. It was something totally different. It was the first dictatorship of the proletariat. Marx described it as a slave revolt. He said the communards were going to war with their enslavers, and he thought that it was only a matter of time before they won. This was celebrated by Marx, but led to a sense of despair among many Europeans. They felt like they were living in an age of prolonged revolution, an age of constant radical and disturbing change that was constantly being ratcheted up. And this fear reached a sort of climax in 1871. A group of left-wing militants took over the cultural centre of Europe, which was of course Paris, and launched a reign of terror and destruction. They were motivated by a spirit of revenge and hatred. They hated the ruling elite, they hated European culture, they hated the prevailing religion, Christianity. So there's a brief description of the Franco-Prussian War and its immediate aftermath. I think we're now ready to discuss how these events impacted Nietzsche's worldview. The events of 1870 and 1871 profoundly influenced Nietzsche's worldview, at least that's my opinion. Many scholars believe that Nietzsche began suffering from PTSD after the Franco-Prussian War. He refused to speak about the war because he wanted to totally banish the memories of it from his mind. 16 of the boys he had gone to school with had been killed in the Franco-Prussian War. They were only in their early 20s, and they were some of the best and brightest men in Germany. He was disgusted with the way that Germany had conducted itself. He thought that the siege of Paris had been conducted in a barbaric way, and he was equally disgusted with the behavior of the Parisians in the immediate aftermath of the war. I'll begin by discussing his disgust for the newly established German Reich, and I'll then move on to discussing his reaction to the Paris Revolution, or the Paris revolutionaries. So, after the Franco-Prussian War, Nietzsche began expressing a violent disgust for militarism and Bismarck's Prussia. Whilst the Franco-Prussian War was still raging, Nietzsche wrote, "What enemies of our culture are now growing out of the bloody soil of this war?" End quote. He also began referring to Bismarck's Prussia as barbaric and anti-cultural, and those were both quotes. After Germany's victory, he wrote a letter to a friend that expressed serious doubts about the direction of his country. He questions whether Prussia's emergence as the preeminent power in continental Europe is good either for Prussia or for Europe. To quote the letter, "Let us hope that we don't have to pay too dearly for the tremendous national success in the war in an area where, in my view, no loss at all can be sustained, in the area of culture. In confidence, I hold the Prussia of today to be a highly dangerous power for culture. We should not be carried away by the general euphoria of victory." End quote. In other words, Nietzsche believed that Germany's great military victory posed a threat to German culture. Now, Nietzsche expressed this idea repeatedly throughout his works. I think he may have gotten it originally from Burckhardt. If you think back to the last episode, you might remember this quote from Burckhardt, which seems super relevant to what we're discussing now. Burckhardt said, "A people cannot be culturally and politically important at the same time. Germany has now made politics its guiding principle, and now it must bear that burden." End quote. So Nietzsche makes this exact same point again and again after the Franco-Prussian War. So I'm going to quote a couple of examples where he basically says the exact same thing that Burckhardt just said. So this comes from Twilight of the Idols. He says, "Even a rapid estimate shows that it is not only obvious that German culture is declining, but that there is sufficient reason for that. In the end, no one can spend more than he has. That is true of an individual. It is true of a people. If one spends oneself for power politics, for economics, world trade, parliamentarianism, and military interests, then one will not have anything left for any other direction. Culture and the state are antagonists. One lives off the other. One thrives at the expense of the other." End quote. In Human All Too Human, he has an aphorism. This is aphorism 481. It's called "Power Politics and What They Cost." Now, I'm going to quote this aphorism at length because it's very relevant to what we're talking about. So here it is. This is Power Politics and What They Cost, aphorism 481 of Human All Too Human. "A nation does not suffer the greatest losses that war and readiness for war involve through the expenses of the war or through the stoppage of trade. The great losses can be attributed to the fact that year after year, its ablest, strongest, and most industrious men are withdrawn in extraordinary numbers from their proper occupations and callings to be turned into soldiers. It sacrifices its most talented men upon the altar of the fatherland, whilst formerly other spheres of activity were open to those talents which are now swallowed up by politics. Every industrious, intelligent, ambitious man of a people greedy for political glory is ruled by this greed, and no longer belongs entirely to his own cause as he once did. Concerns about welfare and warfare devour the intellectual and emotional energy of every citizen. The sacrifices and losses of individual energy and labor is so enormous that the political growth of a nation almost necessarily entails an intellectual impoverishment and exhaustion, a diminished capacity for the performance of works that require great concentration and single-mindedness. The question may finally be asked, is it worth it when all the nobler, finer, and more intellectual plants and products in which its soil was hitherto so rich must be sacrificed to this coarse flour of the nation? End quote. So Nietzsche believed that the German Reich and other, large European states were sacrificing culture for the sake of the nation. All of the energy of the German people was being drained by politics. Their energy was being directed into welfare and warfare. Now, as many of you know, Nietzsche is politically ambiguous. He's admired by many people on the political left. And some of you, after hearing that quote, might be able to understand why. He seems to be making an anti-war argument. But I think it's not really an anti-war argument. I think it's an argument against large states. Large states like the Roman Empire or Bismarck's German Reich drain the energy of their people in a way that small states do not. Now, they might do this through warfare, but they also do it through welfare. I think you could make a very compelling case that the creative energy of European people has been totally drained by the state. If you meet a young, intelligent person today, they're often trying to work in policy. They're trying to improve educational outcomes for disadvantaged young people in urban areas. Or they're trying to make our cities more sustainable through carbon neutral urban planning. In other words, our intellectual elite, if you can call them that, are becoming bureaucrats. All of their energy is directed towards the goals of the state. That might be warfare, but it could also be welfare. I mean, nowadays it's more welfare than warfare. Anyway, at the risk of belaboring the point, I want to read one more quote from Nietzsche. This comes from an essay that he wrote on David Strauss in 1873. It expresses his views on the Franco-Prussian War very clearly. He begins this essay by saying, "Of all the evil consequences which have followed the war with France, perhaps the worst is a widespread, indeed universal error, the error committed by public opinion and by all those who express their opinions publicly, that German culture was victorious. This delusion is in the highest degree destructive, not because it is a delusion, but because it is capable of turning our victory into a defeat. The defeat of the German spirit for the benefit of the German Reich. Our culture played no part in our success in war. Stern discipline, natural bravery and endurance, superior generalship, unity and obedience in the ranks. In short, elements that have nothing to do with culture procured for us the victory over opponents, in whom the most important of these elements were lacking. All impartial judges, and finally the French themselves, have seen Germany's decisive advantage to have lain in the more extensive knowledge possessed by its officers, in the superior training of its troops, and in the greater science of its conduct of the war. In what sense, then, can German culture be said to have triumphed? In no sense, for the moral qualities of stricter discipline and readier obedience have nothing to do with culture. The Macedonian soldier was much better trained than the Greek, but the latter were incomparably more cultured. It can only be the result of confusion if one speaks of the victory of German culture, a confusion originating in the fact that in Germany there no longer exists any clear conception of what culture is." End quote. Now that quote pretty much expresses the same sentiment as the others. For that reason, I don't want to linger on it for too long. You guys surely get the point. But there is one thing about that quote that I would like to discuss in a little more detail, namely the sort of comparison that he makes between what is happening in Germany and what happened in ancient Greece. So he says, the Macedonian soldier was much better trained than the Greek, but the latter were incomparably more cultured. Now, I might be reading into this too much, but I think he very deliberately compares Germany to Macedonia. He believes that the German Reich is, in many ways, comparable to the empire of Alexander the Great. Like Nietzsche said, the Macedonians were much less cultured than the Greeks, but through greater discipline, they were able to defeat the various Greek city-states and incorporate them into their empire. Greece entered into what is now known as, the Hellenistic period. During the Hellenistic period, the city-state model came to an end. 1,500 small republics were subsumed into Alexander's empire. Trade and science flourished in this empire, but culture stagnated. With the exception of Epicurus, the Hellenistic period produced no great philosophers, poets, or painters. It did produce Archimedes, but he is remembered for his contribution to technology and science rather than art and culture. Nietzsche describes German culture as Alexandrian, and by Alexandrian he means a culture like that of Greece during the Hellenistic period, one that is centrally concerned with trade, warfare, and technological advancement. He elaborates on this idea in The Birth of Tragedy, which we're going to talk about in the next episode, but I think that pretty much sums up Nietzsche's attitude towards the newly formed Reich. At this point, he is primarily concerned with culture, and he sees the Reich as a threat to culture. He hated the Paris Commune for similar reasons. He also viewed the Parisian radicals as a threat to European culture. In 1871, it was falsely reported in the Basel newspaper that the Louvre had been burnt down by the Parisian revolutionaries. Upon reading this, Nietzsche rushed out into the street in search of Burckhardt. On meeting, the two men embraced, heartbroken and speechless. Nietzsche described it as the worst day of his life. Shortly after reading this false report, Nietzsche sent a letter to a friend that is worth quoting. He said, "When I heard of the fires in Paris, I felt for several days annihilated and was overwhelmed by fears and doubts. The entire scholarly, scientific, philosophical, and artistic existence seemed an absurdity if a single day could wipe out the most glorious works of art, even whole periods of art." End quote. In another letter he wrote shortly after the Paris Commune was put down, he said, "Beyond the struggle between nations, we were suddenly terrified by the head of this international hydra, which made such a horrible appearance, announcing for the future conflicts of a very different nature." In other words, conflicts between classes. The working classes were beginning to rise up against their enslavers. That's how Marx saw it. It's also how Nietzsche saw it. He saw the Paris Commune as a slave revolt. But unlike Marx, he did not approve of this revolt. He saw it as a mortal threat to European culture. He believed that the revolutionaries were driven by a spirit of revenge and resentment. They wanted to destroy everything that reminded them of the old aristocratic order. In other words, they wanted to destroy everything in Paris worthy of seeing and admiring, any evidence of culture or civilized life. There is a quote from The Birth of Tragedy that seems particularly relevant to the Paris Commune. He says, "Nothing is more terrible than a servile and barbarous class which has come to regard its mode of existence as an injustice and which is prepared to avenge its right, not only on its own account, but on that of all generations." When he wrote this, many scholars believe he was talking about the Paris Commune. Indeed, one Italian scholar went so far to suggest that the subtitle of The Birth of Tragedy could have been "The Crisis of Civilization from Socrates to the Paris Commune." Anyway, Nietzsche recognized that the defeat of the Paris Commune did not represent the end of socialism in Europe. Indeed, in The Will to Power, Nietzsche says, and I quote, "Socialism, or the tyranny of the meanest and the most brainless, is, as a matter of fact, the logical conclusion of modern ideas. In Europe, these ideas have led to violent struggles, but the coming century is likely to be convulsed in far greater struggles, and the Paris Commune, which finds defenders and advocates, even in Germany, will seem to have been but a slight indigestion compared with what is to come. Okay, that note seems to predict, the Russian Revolution, doesn't it? Anyway, Nietzsche understood that socialism was not going away. I want to talk about Nietzsche's attitude towards socialism more broadly now. There has been an attempt by people on the left to claim Nietzsche as one of their own. There was even a book written by a popular YouTuber called How to Philosophize with a Hammer and Sickle, Nietzsche and Marx for the 21st Century. In this book, the author tries to argue that Marx and Nietzsche are compatible, that their ideas should be synthesized for the 21st century. And I don't think that he was the first person to do this. Many socialists have admired Nietzsche. Bernard Shaw comes to mind. These people, these Nietzschean socialists, point out that Nietzsche was critical of capitalism and merchants, which of course is true. Nietzsche frequently expresses his contempt for the bourgeoisie. There are even some passages where Nietzsche does seem somewhat sympathetic towards socialism. For example, in The Wanderer and His Shadow, Nietzsche advocates large-scale intervention in the free market. He thinks we should intervene in the market in order to prevent people from getting too rich. Here is the quote: "We should take all the branches of transport and trade which enable the accumulation of large fortunes out of the hands of private persons or private companies, and look upon those who own too much just as upon those who own nothing, as types fraught with danger to the community." So there you go, rich people are a danger to the community. So people often interpret this passage as an endorsement of socialism because he does seem to be advocating intervention in the market. But I don't think that's the correct interpretation. Nietzsche's not advocating socialism in this passage. He's critiquing capitalism. And you can critique capitalism without being a socialist. Nietzsche was definitely a critic of capitalism, but he was certainly not a socialist. He didn't think that a nation should be ruled by shopkeepers, but that doesn't mean, that he thought it should be ruled by workers instead. Nietzsche expresses contempt for socialism again and again throughout his work. At the risk of belaboring the point, I'm going to give you a few quotes. This first one comes from Thus Spoke Zarathustra. I feel like this quote needs to be read by the so-called Nietzschean socialists. Here it is: "There are some that preach my doctrine of life, but at the same time are preachers of equality. I do not wish to be confounded with these preachers of equality." End quote. I feel like it doesn't get much more explicit than that. He's saying, you cannot preach my doctrine of life and at the same time be a socialist. There is another quote that I want to mention. This comes from Genealogy of Morality. I think he's explicitly talking about the Paris Commune in this quote. Here it is: "Democracy, the even more modern anarchism, and indeed that predilection for the commune, the most primitive form of social structure, which is common to all Europe's socialists, are, in essence, a huge throwback." End quote. So basically he's saying, all of these modern political trends are not in fact modern. The commune is a very old social structure. It's the most dominant social structure among primitive people. Nietzsche is basically saying that socialism is not some, radical new idea. It's a regressive, reactionary idea. It's a desire to go back to a more primitive time. Okay, this last quote comes from The Antichrist, which was written towards the end of Nietzsche's life. Here it is: "Whom among today's rabble do I hate the most? The socialist rabble, the apostles of the weak, who undermine the worker's instinct, his pleasure, his feeling of contentment with his little state of being, who make him envious, who teach him revengefulness. Injustice never lies in equal rights. It lies in the claim to equal rights. What is bad? But I have already answered. All that proceeds from weakness, from envy, from revenge." End quote. I think that sums up Nietzsche's feelings towards socialism. He saw the rise of socialism and nationalism as significant threats to European civilization, and he clearly views socialism as a kind of slave revolt.